Okay, what is version B then? Let's get to version B. Version B is not actually a specific incident, it's an interpretation. It's not a story. Version A is a story, version B is no story. It's simply an interpretation of the verse. And what is this interpretation, and where is the first book that mentions it? Well, the first printed book that I could find that mentions this is Al-Bayhaqi's Dala'il al-Nubuwah, and Al-Bayhaqi died 458 Hijrah. And Al-Bayhaqi, and I'm not saying that it doesn't exist before Al-Bayhaqi, I'm saying in my limited library, this is all that I could come across, and also online I downloaded some books today as well. I could not come across a book that is printed that has this exact version before Al-Bayhaqi, but it is referenced before Al-Bayhaqi, but not with this explicitness. And what is this version B? Version B is the following. Ali Zaynul Abidin. Who is Ali Zaynul Abidin? Who is Ali Zaynul Abidin? Hussein's? Hussein's son. Zaynul Abidin is Hussein's son. Ali Zaynul Abidin asks one of his students, one of his peers, what does Hassan al-Basri say about this verse? وَتُخْفِي فِي نَفْسِكَ مَا اللَّهُ مُبْدِيهِ. What does Hassan al-Basri say about this verse? وَتُخْفِي فِي نَفْسِكَ مَا اللَّهُ مُبْدِيهِ. So this narrator says, I told him what Hassan says about the verse. And from other reports we find out that's version A he is saying. I told him this is what Hassan says. Version A. Ali Zaynul Abidin said, no, not version A. No. Rather, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had informed the Prophet ﷺ that Zaynab would become his wife. Now, pause here. That's version B. That's all version B is. Now, pause here. This changes the whole dynamics. Version A, what was he hiding in his heart? His inclination for Zaynab. Clear. This is what he's hiding. He wants to legitimately marry Zaynab, so he has an inclination towards her, so he wants Zayd to divorce, but he's not going to say it. Why is he not going to say it? Because the people are going to say that, oh, he caused Zayd to divorce and then he married the divorcee, right? So this is version A. Version B says the following, that Allah had told the Prophet ﷺ that Zaynab will become your wife. So Zayd now comes to him and Zayd says, I want to marry Zaynab. And the Prophet ﷺ knows that eventually Zaynab will be his wife. Knowing this, he tells Zayd, don't divorce her. Why? Because he was scared. What was he scared of? That the people will say he married the wife of his adopted son, which is a jahili no-no. Okay, the whole dynamics have been changed here. Okay, every single phrase has a different linkage now. Okay, what did he hide in version A? His inclination. In version B, what did he hide? The fact that he knew that he would eventually marry Zaynab. Okay, version A, what was he scared of? That people will spread rumors. Version B, what was he scared of? What was he scared of? The jahili practice of marrying your adopted son was a very evil thing for them. So people will say, oh my God, he married his adopted son's ex-wife, right? This is what he was scared of. That this was a criticism that was a jahili criticism. Okay, now these are the version A's and the version B's. So version B, chronologically, it does seem to appear after version A. Now, if you look at some early tafsirs, interestingly, some early tafsirs mention both versions together. And most important amongst them, we have Ibn Atiyah in his Al-Muharrar al-Wajiz. Ibn Atiyah died 500 and don't quote me, 540 or so. 540 something. Ibn Atiyah died. Ibn Atiyah mentions all of version A in its entirety. And then he follows it up by mentioning version B, and then he leaves it at that. These are the two versions that I found. This and that. Al-Baghawi, and Al-Baghawi is a very famous scholar of tafsir. He has a famous book called Ma'alim al-Tanzil, and Al-Baghawi died 516. Al-Baghawi mentions the same version A in great detail. And he actually quotes Ibn Abbas as saying that what the Prophet ﷺ hid was a love for Zaynab. وَتُخْفِي فِي نَفْسِكَ. What he hid was a love for Zaynab. Qatada, he mentions as saying that what the Prophet ﷺ hid was a hope that Zayd would divorce her. But then he brings in version B. This is Al-Baghawi. He brings in version B. And he quotes all of from Ali ibn al-Husayn Zayn al-Abidin. And then he says, and I quote from Al-Baghawi, and this second interpretation, version B, is more befitting and more appropriate for the maqam of the prophets. So the first author to say version A seems to be problematic is Al-Baghawi. In my reading, I haven't found anybody who even found version A problematic. Al-Tabari quotes it nonchalantly, nothing, no big deal. Ibn Sa'd, all of these other authors are quoting it. Al-Baghawi, 516 says, some have said that version B is better because it is more appropriate to the status of a prophet. Now, notice here, by the way, why did he choose version B over version A? Not because of isnad, not because of quantity of people, simply because in content it makes more sense that the Prophet should do version B and not version A. Okay? This is the reason he prefers version B over version A. Then he's very interesting. He says, even if the first story, version A, is correct, the other interpretation, which is that he hid for her a love and a desire to marry her, is actually not something that tarnishes the reputation of a prophet. So, Baghawi says, I think version B is better, because that would make our life easier. But even if you insist on version A, it's not the end of the story. Why? Because he says, it's not actually something that tarnishes the reputation of a prophet, for a servant is not criticized for a desire that comes to the heart, as long as he does not intend any evil. Because love and inclination is not something that is in the control of men. And this is Al-Baghawi from 516 Hijrah. Right? At the turn of the 5th century, the turn of the 6th century, Al-Baghawi is saying, I like version B because it's easier for us to swallow. But even if we insist on version A, it's not a big deal because it's only an inclination of the heart. So we find here a shift now. That version B seems to be getting a little bit of traction. And then as we go on and on, version B seems to take more and more role until version A is actually ignored and completely set aside, and then castigated, and then criticized, and then, as we will see, even more bizarre things are said about it. The next tafsir is Ibn al-Jawzi's Zad al-Masir. Ibn al-Jawzi died 597. And Ibn al-Jawzi says there are 4 opinions about what the Prophet ﷺ hid. 4 opinions. Number 1, his love for Zaynab, narrated by Ibn Abbas. Number 2, a promise from Allah that he would eventually marry her, as narrated by Zayn al-Abidin. This is version A and version B. What is 3 and 4? It's actually version A as well. Number 3, a wish that Zayd would divorce her. And this is what Qatada and Ibn Jurayj and Muqatil said. Number 4, the intention that if Zayd divorced her, he would marry her. And this is what has been reported from Ibn Zayd. In other words, if you look at it, these 4 opinions he mentions, 1, 3 and 4 are all version A. 1, 3 and 4 are all version A. And then only 2 is version B, right? So he says, this is what has been narrated. What did he hide? A love for her, hoping that Zayd would divorce. Well, it's the same thing. Or if Zayd divorced, I will marry. Again, it's the same thing, right? Version 2 is only mentioned once, and that is that Allah had told her he would marry Zaynab. And he then says, some scholars have said that it is not possible that the Prophet ﷺ was inclined towards her and wanted Zayd to divorce her. This is who is speaking now? Ibn al-Jawzi. You must have heard the name of Ibn al-Jawzi. He's a famous scholar. Very famous scholar of tafsir and hadith and fiqh. He's a very famous scholar of the Hanabila. He's of the Hanbali madhab. And he's well known for, his most famous book is Talbis Iblis. And also he wrote Sifat al-Safwa. And they have actually both been translated into Urdu and some of them even into English. Very famous scholar. So Ibn al-Jawzi says, some scholars have said that it is not possible that the Prophet ﷺ was inclined towards her and he wanted Zayd to divorce her, even though this is what is commonly found in the books of tafsir. So he admits, look, this is the predominant interpretation. But this story has been found problematic. Rather, these scholars have said that he was criticized in this incident for concealing the fact that eventually she would become his wife. And that it is also said that he felt out of a concern for her that if Zayd would divorce her, he would marry her to fulfill the ties of kinship since she was his cousin. In other words, Ibn al-Jawzi removes the love factor completely, removes the inclination factor. And he says he wanted to marry her to take care of her because she's his cousin. But he doesn't actually quote an authority. He simply says this is better really he is a modified version B basically, right? Same goes with Al-Qurtubi and the famous Andalusian scholar Al-Qurtubi in 671, that he mentions version A in a very explicit detail, then he follows it up with version B, and then he says, our scholars have said that this is the better interpretation of the verse, and it is this interpretation that the critical researchers have approved. So we notice here that in the first 3-4 centuries, it's only version A that is predominant. Version B is found. In the 4th, 5th centuries, version A and B are both mentioned. But then some people began to say version B is better, let's just ignore version A. Then in the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, version A is basically never mentioned anymore. And the best example for this is Ibn Kathir. And after him, Ibn Hajar. Ibn Kathir died 774. Ibn Hajar died 852. So we see now an evolution taking place. And what happens is, the later scholars, for example, Ibn Kathir says, and Ibn Hajar says basically the exact same thing. When they talk about this verse, they say, some of the earlier books have reports that we would rather not mention. Literally. We would rather not mention them. Some of the earliest books of tafsir have reports, we want to just cross them out. Ibn Kathir says, we don't want to waste our time talking about them. They are just not authentic. Not even mentioning what it is. It's not even a mention. It's simply only version B is mentioned, and there's no mention at all of version A. In fact, we don't want to mention it. So Ibn Hajar never mentions it. Ibn Kathir does not have anything. He simply says, we will not mention anything of this. We're just going to cross it out. And then what happened as a result of this was that later scholars, they actually began to say that these other versions are fabrications. And many modern scholars who are not experts in tafsir or hadith, but they're famous amongst the masses, they went even more bizarre. And they said that this version A is a fabrication by evil Orientalists that have corrupted our books. And they have introduced it, to bring doubts upon the character of the Prophet ﷺ. And frankly, that type of conspiracy theories and whatnot, we simply have to reject. Interestingly enough, I actually found Ibn al-Qayyim, and we know Ibn al-Qayyim who he is, in his book Ad-Da'u wad-Dawa, which is a really interesting book, by the way, just a footnote here. Ad-Da'u wad-Dawa, somebody wrote Ibn al-Qayyim a letter, and the letter is ambiguous, that he's suffering from a problem, and he doesn't mention what is the problem. And the whole Ad-Da' wad-Dawa, which means the disease and the cure for the disease. That's what it means. Ad-Da' wad-Dawa. Ad-Da' is the disease. Dawa is the cure for the disease. What is this problem? It's actually ishq. The problem is ishq. Okay? And because of ishq, how many problems arise in this world? Right? Most of the problems of this world go back to ishq. Okay? So this young man writes Ibn al-Qayyim a letter that I'm suffering from. And he doesn't mention the problem, but it's understood. He is completely ashiq with a ma'shuq. Okay? And he is saying, I don't know what to do, and I need help in this and that. So Ibn al-Qayyim writes a beautiful book, Ad-Da'u wad-Dawa. Beautiful. It's worth its weight in gold. And it's all about how to cure the problems of basically ishq in this regard. And he has entire chapters dedicated to ishq, mashallah, tabarakallah. And he has a whole chapter about the dangers of ishq. Okay? Some of you guys need to read these chapters, huh? Haqiqi. You want to start about ishq? There's much that can be said, but I will keep that side hidden, don't worry. There's a beautiful line of poetry. Khalas, you opened one out of me. There's a beautiful line of poetry. SubhanAllah, what does it begin? Raman al-washiquna, the gossip mongers have accused me of loving her. The gossip mongers have accused me of loving her. And I say to them, that is a sin I will never repent from. ذَاكَ ذَنْبٌ لَسْتُ مِنْهُ أَتُوبُ. Okay, so much can be said about ishq and ma'shuq. Here we have Ibn al-Qayyim writing a book, Ada' wa Dawa. He has a chapter called The Dangers of Ishq. After this, right at the end of the book, he has the permissibility of certain types of ishq. Now, not all ishq is haram, obviously, right? Some ishq is good, some ishq is halal, some ishq is necessary for a happy married life. Is that not the case? What, you guys didn't think of marriage when talking of ishq? La hawla quwwata illa billah. La hawla quwwata illa billah. When I mention marriage, you laugh. When I mention ishq, your imagination goes elsewhere. I hope your wives are not sitting here. Okay. Ibn al-Qayyim mentions certain types of ishq are good. They're halal, they're encouraged. Correct? Right? And he mentions stories from the Salaf, from the Sahaba, of halal ishq. Okay? And of what he mentions is this story. Very interesting. He mentions a sanitized version A, that the Prophet ﷺ saw Zaynab and then Zayd divorced her and then Allah married Zaynab to the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, so this is interesting that Ibn al-Qayyim seems to find no problem with this